but this book changed my life. So I'm going to give you the opportunity to tell us a little about yourself. What
Yes.
What do you want to say about who you are and why you're so exciting to me?
Well, I'm first and foremost, I guess, a professor of anatomy and anthropology here at Idaho State University in Pocatello, Idaho, southeastern Idaho. So I make a living teaching human gross anatomy in the health professions programs at the graduate level, graduate students who are going on to be physician's assistants, occupational therapists, physical therapists, and so on. We have a whole litany of health professions programs. But then my emphasis as an anatomist is in physical anthropology. I'm interested in the evolutionary morphology of the human body, how we came to be the way we are, and in particular, I'm curious about bipedalism, and that's kind of where the lines crossed. Is the prospect of there being another bipedal primate out there has always been fascinating. I mean, from a more of a technical, professional perspective, perhaps, ever since I was a little kid, I've been fascinated by the prospect, the mystique of the mystery of the existence of Sasquatch. So, you wrap those two together, and how can you not be pulled in? And it's from that perspective, primarily that professional perspective, one who studies the adaptations, especially of the lower extremity in the foot, and has been preoccupied with fossil footprints and the study of therefore the appearance of modern human and non-human primate footprints under natural conditions and controlled conditions in order to better interpret those. So when I was brought up face to face with a long line of tracks in southeastern Washington, as I introduced the book, that was what set the hook. I mean, here were not just one spurious or enigmatic anomalous footprint, but a whole line, a whole trackway of these 15-inch tracks that were so compelling and so for me, life-changing, because it really brought it to a head. I mean, it had gotten to the point where, youthful fascination and intrigue, and then, adult curiosity and so forth, and interest. But this really brought it to a point that these tracks were so compelling that, the hair stood up on the back of my neck as that realization set in. They really do exist. Just walked by here last night.
Aren't they the most common evidence?
The footprint, yes, I think, and the most objective. I mean, because if they're well documented, whether photographically or through casting, or now 3D scanning, there are apps you can download on your iPhone and take your iPhone and take about a dozen pictures, and it'll stitch together a three-dimensional record of your impression, your foot impression there in the ground.
That's fantastic.
There'll be more now.
Yeah, it's a lot easier than schlepping plaster and water around in the back.
Yeah.
But they can be examined. They can be objectively evaluated. Whereas with the sighting, it's always difficult. It's always challenging. I recently reviewed and commented upon an article where eyewitness accounts were evaluated. And it was fascinating reading because the authors had summarized some more recent evidence. The skeptics love to throw out all eyewitness testimony. They've long appealed to the work of people like Elizabeth Loftus, who's done a lot of, psychologist who's done a lot of research on what they conclude is the unreliability of eyewitness testimony and memory, especially regressed memories. And there's value in her work and what but it's almost the pendulum swung too far in the pessimistic direction, I think. And these authors more recently kind of showed there's one particular worker who's kind of pushed back on this as a psychologist and said, and his research shows that actually people's memories are really quite reliable under the right circumstances and when taken from the right perspective. And so, we're left with this quandary. When people expect to see something, their expectations can influence their interpretation. There's the experience, and then there's the interpretation of the experience. And with the footprints, if they do the documentation, you can then evaluate their interpretation of their experience by objectively evaluating their footprint. With the encounter, you're left sort of to the foibles of their training, their experience, their composure, their motivation, their agenda, if there is one. And so it's a challenging. I mean, I from our little previous conversation and the topics you dealt with, I know it's a challenge for you too, to you're constantly winnowing the wheat from the chaff in order to make a case for something that is very difficult to nail down objectively, because we don't have the instrumentation or the means to document and replicate some of these subtle subjective experiences. And
it's exciting to talk to you though, because I was fooled. I mean, one of my favorite stories is some cows that were in love. I took my kids back to clean. I know, I didn't know what they sounded like. So we were way out in the middle of nowhere. Some scouts had left a camp, and I went back with just my two boys to clean it up. We volunteered. So it was just us. There had been 10 adults and 30 Boy Scouts. We went back with just me and my two sons and cleaned the camp because everyone had to bug out. Big rainstorm. So we were cleaning everything up, and then we're sleeping all alone. And in the middle of the night, cows, I didn't know this, but it was, so I'm out with my pistol and a flashlight, and I'm looking every which way, and my head was filled with things I'm not familiar with, least of all Sasquatch. But yeah, it was in my head what I would see. It wasn't until I got back I met some ranchers at the big ranching area, and they said, oh, that was just cows in love. That was a romance novel. I was really upset.
Yes.
And so if I'd seen a footprint, you could just imagine how irrational my report, if I could even take a chill pill long enough to even talk. That was messages people sent to our page was, how dangerous are they? Ask Dr. Meldrum. That was one of the questions I saw a couple times was, if we're out in the woods, how dangerous are people saying they are, other than throwing rocks, I've heard. Read about.
Right. Well, it's always depends on the circumstances. I mean, obviously, anytime you're dealing with an animal that's potentially 8.5 feet tall and nearly 1,000 pounds, you should treat it with some deference. Just like if you were up
here, have my sandwich.
Right. You don't want to go up and surprise spank a silverback gorilla on the backside. You might get a reaction you weren't prepared for. But on the other hand, most of the encounters are really kind of mundane. The animals are retiring and reclusive and very secretive, and if they bump into someone, it's usually it's more often than not by happenstance. I mean, there have been occasions when the Sasquatch, I think, were curious. I think with intelligence comes greater curiosity and interest in human activities and the sights and smells and sounds of human activity. And so, that's why you get the report someone goes out the side door to grab an armful of firewood from the cabin, and there's a Sasquatch standing just in the light cast from the picture window, watching the big screen TV, essentially, which is featuring the people inside with all their
they're watching the game.
That's right. So there's that. And but then on the other side of the coin is I guess you could say there's always some bad apples, or there are instances where another side of their behavior manifests itself. And of course, the native traditions often include much more nefarious activities, whether it's braves, hunters being abducted, whether it's a woman, a female being abducted, or children snatched. Here regionally, we have there's a traditional story that supposedly took place down, or is reported. I don't want to say supposedly because not to cast any disparage on it whatsoever, but it's reported that decades ago there were tribal people out in the sagebrush in their teepees, and it was a very cold winter, and a crying baby apparently attracted the attention of a passerby, and a big hairy arm comes under the teepee tent and snatches away the baby. And one of the names for the Sasquatch translates the eater of children. And,
oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Well,
I didn't know that.
This sounds like a just so story, right? Just something maybe that's told well, and it's repeated elsewhere. The Zonaqua of the Pacific Northwest is also characteristic of the cannibal giantess. She's the one who always has her lips in the pursed posture, like she's whistling or calling, whooping.
Oh, I saw that in your book. Yes,
that's right. And she's also depicted with these big oversized hands, which the tradition tells that she smears with pine pitch so she can grab the children and scoop them up and throw them over her shoulder into the basket, the crude basket she carries on her back. And that theme is replicated all throughout the Pacific and Intermountain West, clear down into the Southern Rockies. It's really interesting.
Really? How far south? Because we're in the Southern Rockies.
Oh, that's right. Well, I was over in the Wind River Range of Wyoming, so not as far south, but we were over towards the east. But there was
we're okay. We're okay. And our kids are grown up, so
yeah. Well, see, down in the Spanish South of the Rockies, there's and it's interesting. I'm not sure if it's a conflated story, but and I can't pronounce it properly. But the La Llorona, have you heard of the Wailing Woman?
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of a similar story where now oftentimes she's depicted as this sort of bleached out because she drowns in the flood, bleached out corpse with the veil and the linens kind of flowing behind her nightdress, and she wanders around wailing, calling for children, which she snatches and sticks into a basket on her back. But some traditions, some stories say that this woman lost her children in a flash flood and went crazy, had a nervous breakdown, essentially just collapsed, ran into the forest. And the stories go that she became a wild woman and could be seen covered with hair, walking around in the floodplains at night, wailing for her lost children. And it ties in with the Zonaqua, the Pacific Northwest, just so closely. It's really, really bizarre. But in any case, there's that side of the story that suggests that, that's what I lost my train of thought for a second. Sounds like a just so story. And even the natives of the Pacific Northwest, when they tell about the Zonaqua and that tradition, they kind of chuckle and say, yeah, this is a kind of a boogeyman story to keep the children in line. And and I've had students who've said things like that to me, where there was one student, she was actually from up in southeastern Washington, and she said growing up, her granny would say in the summer, they didn't have air conditioning, they would leave the windows wide open so they'd get a breeze blowing in, and she'd say, now you settle down and you be quiet and go to sleep, or else the lost brother, which was one of their titles, the lost brother will come along and he'll reach in here and snatch you away and we won't know what's happened to you. And they would lie there, they said, pull the covers up real tight and not make a peep. Afraid of this giant monster snatching them. Well, what's interesting though is, we were talking about this one time, and one of my friends who was with the Park Service up in the Seattle area, he had been with the Peace Corps in Africa and then stayed on and became a ranger, a park ranger. and they were tasked with trying to study or habituate the chimpanzees there to ecotourism, to human contact for tourist trade. But he told the story. He said something that hasn't been widely publicized because they're trying to attract tourists, not scare them away. There was an incident where a native woman had parked her baby on a blanket under a bush while she was a short distance off hoeing in the field. And a big chimpanzee came along. It was a drought condition. Food was scarce and so forth. Chimpanzee snatches up the baby and makes off with it. The field hands all go running after, but before they can catch up, it's dispatched and partially eaten the child.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And so all of a sudden, this Just So story about Sasquatch takes on a whole different tone. Well, it turns out that during this drought, during about a 7-month period, there were 12 instances of young children and toddlers being snatched by chimpanzees.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
so you know, take a drought in Africa with chimpanzees and make it a very hard winter in North America with Sasquatch, and you've got the exact same behavior. It's just really fascinating.
Wow. We were talking about you're doing another book, or can we say you're doing another book?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Big secret, big reveal here. It's scary.
No, it's a ways off though.
We're going for that. And when you were doing that research as opposed to for the Sasquatch book,
right?
When we were on this one, did you run into more evidence again? I mean, because you were doing other research.
Well,
was there more?
I'm very ready to do a second edition of the Sasquatch book, but this book is and there certainly is more that could be talked about and expanded upon. But the second book that I'm working on now is it casts the net more broadly and examines other relic hominoids, as I like to refer to them, these relic species of human and near human primates that may exist in the various corners of the globe. I've constantly am asked, well, what's the difference between Sasquatch and the Yeti? Or there's the orang pendek, the little person that has been so invigorated by the discovery of the Hobbit, Homo floresiensis, these fossil skeletons in the island of Flores in Indonesia that suggest that until just a few tens of thousands of years ago, at least, there was a little diminutive, 3 foot, 3'5" human relative, but a very primitive one, one that was more like an Australopithecine, like Lucy, than by like a modern human. It's kind of I mean, one of the things that's intriguing that I think is particularly interesting about the book too is that the book that got me started in this was Ivan Sanderson's Abominable Snowman Legend Come to Life from 1961. So that's 50, 60 years ago. And my book will, in many ways, will actually be, it will simply not simply, but it will transpose his thesis into a modern context of current knowledge of paleontology and so forth and evolutionary history. But the categories that he settled upon, the various types of, he called them ABSM, Abominable Snowmen, this acronym for Abominable Snowmen, are the very types that I am elaborating upon, but from a more modern perspective and with much more evidence, and again, a lot of emphasis on the footprints, because as
right. Well, and I don't know how many people are brand new. We got some people coming from Bigfoot groups to watch you talk about this, and they talk about the front paw and the rear paw, and they overlay, and then people mistake that for one longer print.
Sure.
But when we're looking at it, a cast where you're looking at it, you can read a lot of, like, what do they call this? The fingerprints, and the shape of the foot, and even the injuries, like if something's split or there's been a broken bone or a deformity, it's like you not only know that that's a foot,
Right.
And even BB, I can't remember the page, but that guy who said, oh, well, it's got a double rotator. And you were talking about how infants have that in humans when they're young, and that apes or simians, or I can't
Yeah.
recall,
The
that
split,
it's like that does.
split ball.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Right. The
Right.
split. Yeah, go ahead. Because
Well,
these are the things that don't fool you because of
The science
the
behind it.
specialty.
right.
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 Yeah.
Yeah.
Legend meets science.
Even when John Napier, I mean, when John Napier wrote his seminal book on Bigfoot and the abominable snowman or Yeti, he concluded that there was something out there. Something was leaving footprints. He's the one that famous quote about something making footprints is attributable to. But he thought that there were two categories of footprints. One that he called human-like, and then there was this one, he called the hourglass, which was which was represented by a few examples that typified or exemplified that quote split ball. He never drew a lot of attention other than noting that this was one of the characteristics, but he concluded that one or the other had to be fake. He couldn't imagine a population that had two such distinct foot forms. Well, the problem is there is no distinction. The things that the things that he was drawing attention to just were extremes of variation in the appearance of footprints due to differences in substrate and so forth, and some individual variation. I mean, like the degree of webbing beneath the toes and between the toes, and so forth. He didn't recognize the extreme flexibility and the mid-tarsal break, which, if not taken into account, makes it very difficult to explain why some footprints are so remarkably flat, and yet some look more human-like with an apparent arch, but it's a transient feature. I mean, if your foot's really flexible, I mean, this is an argument that I've had with my own colleagues in interpreting things like the famous Laetoli hominin footprints, because they'll focus in on a track that looks most human, and they'll say, look, it's essentially it's just like a little human walking through the ash. But if you look at the very next track, the footprint is very flat, and there's a pressure ridge that could only be explained as the result of a mid-tarsal break. Well, if you have a very flexible foot, it's possible on one step to have a flat, flexible appearing foot with a mid-tarsal pressure ridge. And in the next, if your foot is what we call supinated, if it's twisted just a little bit, then it looks suddenly much more human. Our foot, though, is kind of frozen in that latter position with the arch. Right. But because our arch is fairly rigid, you would not expect in a line of human tracks that kind of variation. You just get arched footprints. And so, so when I talk to my colleagues about the Laetoli tracks, I say, well, then explain to me this track. If you think you're right, how can you? But then likewise with the same with the Sasquatch, people say, oh, they just have human-like footprints, and they'll show an example. Well, I can show two examples from one trackway that show both expressions. So Napier, I think, falsely dichotomized and gave too much credit to hoaxing to as an explanation for too many footprints. But that split ball was something that perplexed people for a long time, until you realize that when you don't have an arch, then there isn't that remarkable differentiation of the ball of the foot with a much thicker pad and a much more reinforced with connective tissue sole pad underneath the heads of the metatarsals, the ball of the foot, all across the foot. And as a result, when those long toes that are webbed a little bit higher flex, it's just like the palm of your hand. You flex your fingers, boom, there's a crease right across the. And as you point out, a newborn's foot still has that kind of primitive condition. The sole pad hasn't finished growing and developing. And if you go home and look at your birth certificate, if you've got an inked footprint, you almost certainly have some sort of a crease right across the ball of your foot. Sasquatch
They-
just retains that.
Hmm. How many of the people in, because you're talking to your colleagues, you said, how many of them fall in that category of willfully ignorant? 50?
Thankfully, it's a small group. I mean,
Oh,
I
good.
think
He's
I,
shrinking maybe, right?
I think the majority. I mean, to give credit where credit's due, I hope the majority are just kind of, ambivalent.
Oh,
They don't have a dog in this race, or this fight.
yeah.
A dog in the fight. I guess that's the proper metaphor. Horse in this race, dog in the fight. But
Hmm.
and so they're willing to just wait idly, not idly on this vis-a-vis this topic
Hmm.
until the final conclusive proof is, you know,
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
they're sort of the attitude of Michael Shermer. The science starts once you have a body, which
Uh,
Ah,
is an ignorant statement. I mean, that's not a valid statement, a
yeah.
valid position, in my opinion.
I
But
do you there was a documentary, the guy chasing Bigfoot is what I want to call it, but I remember you following a track, and I could be, because I get off track, but yeah, it went up a steep area in mud and the toes were in digging in to get up. Do you remember something? And I wanted to ask you about that one because it was
there,
amazing to me how it
well,
transitioned from flat walking to going up a hill, and it's just toes were slipping a part of it.
sure. Well, there are numerous examples of that, as you would expect if this is the real deal or not. In fact, one of my own examples, the one that I saw in '96, the creature started running. It wasn't a real steep hill, but there was enough of a little incline on this little roadway, and given the muddy conditions, he was up, or she, I think it was probably a she, given the length and narrowness of the foot,
Yeah.
was up on the front half of the foot and slid. As you said, the toes tightly flexed and gripped into the mud, and so they left very distinctive imprints of all five toe pads. And in fact, because of the depth of the imprint, you could actually see the profile of the big toe and the little toe against the outside edge of the imprint. So when the cast was poured and lifted out and cleaned, you could literally see, the three segments of the little toe, which has
Mhm.
three phalanges, and then the two segments of the big toe, which has only two phalanges, and just as clear as could be.
Mhm.
And
Amazing.
yeah,
I,
no, it's the anatomical detail just never ceases to surprise me in these in the good, clearest examples. Sometimes their clarity, their um, the distinctness works against them in some people's minds. They're too good, so they must
oh,
be hoaxed. See, and
oh,
yet
okay.
the details are so subtle and so fine. Those are the ones that are the least likely to be hoaxed, because there just aren't that many people out there who have the wherewithal, the knowledge, and the means to
Right,
perpetrate such a hoax, or to take the time to do it.
right.
Out,
right.
out in the boondocks and
That first story in the very beginning of the book, the guy's hunting for giant trout. He's 800 miles north of
yeah,
Saskatchewan. I can't recall, but it's
right,
the boonies. He had to take a seaplane, a
right.
pontoon plane. It had to land on the lake, and then they found a track. And it's funny because those of you who haven't read this yet, they're following these tracks for nearly a mile when it dawned on them, maybe we don't want to find whatever made these prints. And so that was such a great story, though. And did someone go and make imprints, or is everybody shooting this stuff now with the scanners you talked about?
Well, on that occasion, they weren't even in the mindset. They were there to scout out filming locations for this story about the other wildlife, the salmon, and it
Yeah.
was purely a lark. Plus, when they got back to the pilot and asked him to fly over to see if they could maybe catch up and see it out there, he wouldn't do it. He just, no, he didn't want anything to do with this at all.
Oh, really?
It's
Oh yeah,
interesting.
yeah, and so it's, well, there's different attitudes, and I mean there's some people have a tremendous amount of deference and some trepidation, and then for others it's just part of the landscape. I can always remember and chuckle when I think about Dr. John Bindernagel was up there in BC, and there was a sighting on the reservation, one of the reservations, and he was allowed to come on and do some investigation. And he, on the trail, bumped into a little group of teenagers, tribal members, and he was asking them about what they knew and what they'd seen and so forth, and had they seen any more footprints. And they said, oh yeah, we see footprints, we see them every once in a while. And he goes, well, have you ever taken any pictures of them? And they all just kind of looked at each other and laughed and said, well, why would we do that? I mean, it was just a totally different mindset. Here's Dr. Bindernagel, the scientist, documenting and collecting evidence, and well, did you take pictures? And for them, it's just like, why would we bother doing that?
They're all over the
yeah,
place.
yeah.
Yeah. So it just never even would occur to them. It's just that's not in the mindset. So it's interesting how different people are motivated different ways.
I have a question real quick.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to indicate how do they live in family groups, or is there any evidence to how they are living?
Right. Well, we only have little clues. I mean, obviously, we don't have observations to really systematic observations to draw upon, but the clues include the footprints, which are almost always solitary individuals, or what we take to be females. Again, the difference between a male and a female, it's kind of like with a human population. For a given length, the female skeleton is less robust. It's a little more gracile, and so the foot tends to be a little narrower. And likewise, if you look at Patty's footprint, the best contrast right in front of us, if you look at Patty's footprint, the Patterson-Gimlin film subject, which is clearly female, and she has a 14.5 to 15-inch foot that is only about 4 to 4.5 inches wide across the forefoot, and it's more parallel-sided. I mean, she still has a very broad heel, but there just isn't quite as much girth to the foot skeleton. Whereas there was what we think was the big male of that area, a big 16-inch footprint, and he has a much more wedge-shaped foot with a broader, almost 7 inches across the ball of the foot. And so sometimes footprints like Patty's, including her own, are discovered in company with juvenile or even infant footprints. The Freeman footage from southeastern Washington, at the time he was up there and captured that video clip, the first tracks he came upon were little tracks that were only about 4.5, 5 inches long. And there was a whole line of these, and he cast several of them. I have the originals in my collection, and we have video footage of the actual footprints. And in the video footage, in fact, when Doug Hychek, who had the experience up there with the giant salmon you were describing, he was digitizing Paul's film and looking at it very carefully. And there's a parting shot where the subject in the film is making distance away, but at one point, all of a sudden, it reaches down and it scoops something up. And as it's lifting this object up, you can see these looks like little legs with the feet grabbing onto the fur of Mama, as she hoists it up to her hip, and off it goes. But, it fits very well, because at that time, I don't even know that Doug knew that there were these little tracks at the scene, at that site that Paul had also cast.
Oh,
so anyway,
cool.
I got off of your question. So those clues plus eyewitness encounters, which are typically of single individuals, would suggest that they're probably solitary or semi-solitary for much of the time, at least when they're out foraging. Now, do they come back? Chimpanzees, for example, spread out, but then they come back, kind of back together as a group for protection when they're sleeping. Orangutans are fairly solitary. And a big orangutan male, instead of defending a harem of females, he defends a territory. And that territory overlaps a couple of other females and their offspring, if they have some. And when the females are receptive, in between offspring, they seek out the male for his company. And that's pretty infrequently, every 6 or 7 years, kind of like a Vulcan, where they only mate once in a great period of time. But
yeah, that's not a romance novel.
Yeah.
There.
That's right. Yeah. So yeah, Sasquatch might not. Well, it would be a snapshot of their love life, when they, because I'm sure it's
forward.
Yeah.
That's a lot of fun though. We've got to get with you again, because I know our fans would like to ask questions.
Yes.
And
yes.
I'm excited about your new book, and how close on the new, or do I dare ask?
It's a ways. It's I think the manuscript's about 2/3 of the way, but then all the illustrations and all, it's a couple of years away. Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Well,
thank you for this, because I had not had any treatment of that. I mean, I saw original Patterson Gimlin at a basketball arena, because it was like a pay-per-view in the 70s, and everyone went to see it. And I was so excited going to libraries, but this is a standalone, really. There isn't another one like it. And you mentioned Napier, which is another book that is pretty, is outside of yours. I don't have books like this.
Well, there's some good ones. John Napier's, it's a little dated now, but it's a good perspective, and sometimes these dated ones are helpful to understand the backdrop against which these things are being interpreted, and sometimes why they're rejected out of hand, because they just don't fit with the paradigm, with the conventional accepted wisdom of the time. And at the time, well, here, so if you got just a minute, Napier, you talked about Patterson.
Just keep coming.
One of the things that's so interesting is, and I've often asked myself, why was there such a visceral rejection of the possibility that this film really depicted something new and extraordinary? Well, at the time, in the 60s, it was thought that human evolution proceeded in this single file fashion, that there weren't a lot of species, because there's only nature only allows one species in any given niche. And so the hominin niche, bipedalism, enlarged brain and culture, could only have one representative. And so there was this succession of replacements that supplanted the preceding species. So in 60s, this was at its peak of debate and contest and advocacy. And so when Patterson proposes a new bipedal hominin, well, wait a minute, that doesn't fit in our picture, so it must be fake. Well, even, and likewise, the ideas about how evolution of bipedalism emerged and how the human took shape were in their infancy still. And so when against that backdrop, when John Napier looks at this film, he was amongst the scientists, the first scientist that viewed the film in the United States, and probably amongst the most open-minded of those who viewed it. But he looks at this and he says, the main thing that I have a problem with is, from the waist up, it looks typically like an ape, but from the waist down, it looks human. Now, it's inconceivable that such a combination of traits would be found in nature, so it must be hoaxed. Well, about that book came out in the early 70s, and then later that decade, we had the fanfare surrounding the discovery of Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, with much more complete skeletons that gave us a much better and more conclusive idea about the way early Australopithecines walked on two legs, the shape of their pelvis, the way their knees came together, a foot without a thumb-like big toe. And how was Lucy described in the popular press? Isn't this interesting? From the waist up, she looks like a chimpanzee with a little brain and big jaws and big teeth. But from the waist down, she looks like a human. Well, now, wait a minute. that was the very combination of traits that disqualified the Patterson-Gimlin film in the mind of its most, its potential advocate in John Napier. So it's really interesting how the film has actually anticipated what we now know, by decades. So reading Napier's book and understanding that historical context is really an insightful experience. Now, there's lots of others that Dr. Bindernagel, his book is fantastic. North America's Great Ape, the Sasquatch. Robert Halley has written a fantastic summary as well. Robert's a little more scientifically minded. He's not a scientist, but he's a health practitioner, and so he's kind of trained a little more in the sciences. And so his book, Raincoat Sasquatch, is an excellent. Chris Murphy's books, Meet the Sasquatch and Know the Sasquatch, are excellent, almost scrapbook kind of books that are, I'm a very visual person, and so his are profusely, has hundreds of photographs and figures in it. So all those I would highly recommend. So there's a lot. You have to be careful. I tell you, Bigfoot books have been like mushrooms lately, and they've just been popping. And not always, it's like with mushrooms, you got to be really careful. It's hard to tell the difference between the good ones and the bad ones.
Oh, that's fine.
Well, I'm glad. Thanks for lining them out, because we'll list those. We'll list them for people to just have a reference. Sometimes I just want to be entertained too, because those are the shows. Sometimes I know that I'm just reading. The first the miners in Washington way back who said that they threw rocks. Someone popped a shot at one of them, and their whole story, which I don't know if anyone ever researched it for scientific point of view, but for an exciting, we're in the woods and who wants to tell a scary story around the fire. We did a lot of skinwalker type stuff, and that's enough. Yeah. So that's another one.
Have you seen the new one by Brooks? I can't think of his first name. It's Mel Brooks' son, he wrote the zombie World War Z. He wrote World War Z previously.
Really?
Anyway, yeah. He invited me to write a foreword to the book, but I've kind of drawn the line at fiction, not doing that for works of fiction. But apparently it's kind of taken off. My kids have read it, and they said it was pretty exciting, but there's a lot of blood and guts. It's not a Harry and the Hendersons story at all.
Yeah, a lot of them go there that way. But
that was a cute show.
Yeah, it was. Well, the big question in everyone's mind, a lot of us are wondering, who does Bigfoot and Sasquatch support in the for president, Biden or Trump? And do you know? And if you do another book, who would you like to narrate it? And those are the big questions our fans always have. But gosh, if we could correct our technical difficulties around here, I will bother you again if you'll forgive me, and we'll continue to promote your book because I love it and can't thank you enough. Seriously.
Yes, thank you so much for your time.
This was great.
Wonderful.
You're fabulous.
And you're a very entertaining speaker as well.
Yeah.
Makes all your scientific stuff very, very easy to listen to.
Science is fun.
And understand. Yes.
So thank you, Dr. Meldrum. And,
thank you so much for your time.
If you see someone hanging around your house, or peeking in the windows, it's probably us.
Yeah.
Just looking for more info.
Okay.
Watching the game.
Yeah,
watching the game.
So, thanks very much. Talk to you soon.
All right.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.